Good afternoon. I am Jen Powell. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for Contrarian Boston. Welcome to our Contrarian Boston State of the Massachusetts Housing Crisis 2024. Today, we are going to be looking at some of the headwinds that have made it incredibly difficult to build enough new housing in Massachusetts, and what do we actually need to be doing to boost construction and bring down the prices of housing and of rents. And with that, I will turn it over to our editor-in-chief, Scott Van Voorhis.
Thanks, Jen. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. We launched Contrarian Boston 3 years ago to report on local and national news. We've been able to do this with the incredible support of our readers, who believe it is vital to have this independent perspective. We're going to start with some opening remarks by Jay Doherty, CEO of Cabot & Forbes, followed by a panel discussion. Jay has been building housing for decades now in the Boston area and has a unique perspective on some of the challenges we face. Thank you, Jay. Whenever you're ready.
Are these slides that I have up, are you
You're
able
up.
to? Okay.
Yep.
All right. So what I just hang around. So I want to cover 3 or 4 things. There's a lot of data here. So if there are things that people are interested in, we can talk about how to provide that later. The first is that I'm all set. That I believe, based on our experience and research over the last couple of years, that the production of multifamily housing in Greater Boston is going to be dropping substantially and stay at a very depressed level until 2030 or beyond. I'll touch upon that first. Second, I want to talk a little bit about why that is in terms of the world as we live in it now. Then I will touch briefly on why there are several different constraints in Massachusetts that are harming production and what the consequences are of that constraint and this situation. The thing I want to emphasize most, and I've been trying to emphasize as I've talked to state decision makers and others, is that the word crisis doesn't really do justice to where we're headed and where we are. It really, I think, has graduated to the level of an emergency because of what's happening and what will, I think, continue to happen over the next bit. So the first slide you see here is a slide that is drawn from several sources, including Jones Lang LaSalle, Walker and Dunlop, and our own research. And what it shows, if you look at 2023 was the last year in which the financing.
Jay, sorry to interrupt you. Your calendar function is open, I think. You want to close it? It's blocking one of your slides, that's all. There you go. Thank you. Sorry. Go ahead, proceed.
Can you see my cursor?
No.
Doesn't matter. So in 2022, the finance markets for real estate development shut down. And that included housing, and it included multifamily housing in Boston. What you see in your travels around the city are the wave of housing that commenced 2022 or earlier that is now concluding. So for example, we just opened a project we started 3 years ago in Fenway. It's 365 units. We are building a project in Wakefield of 440 units, and we just got that under the wire. We actually commenced construction in 23, and there are several other projects like that. But what you see in the dark bar of 23, 24, and 25 is the delivery of that current inventory of construction. And what you see in the red is the shutdown of the financing markets, which began in 22 and have not reopened. We have seen some preliminary things in 1 or 2 projects that are able to gain financing, but by and large, there is not financing available for equity or debt in the multifamily Greater Boston market. Now, the purple lines are what it takes to build a multifamily project. Now, I'm sure many of our panelists know But to emphasize, the lead time from the time we contract for a site to the time where we will open a unit is usually at least 5 years. The Wakefield project I mentioned, the permitting was 36 months, 3 years, and it was zoned for housing. It still took 3 years, and that will open in about 4 years or 3 years. So you have this phase coming up where you see the lighter colors for 2026 and on, 2026, 27, 28, 29, 30. They will not be seeing any delivery of new construction. And until the financing markets open up, that will be the go sign for the 5-year horizon. Now, there will be a few projects. We have one in Woburn that are fully designed and shovel ready, have a building permit. We have not been able to finance it in the last 18 months. We're going to try again now. So a few of those will break that and come on. But in general, instead of, we normally produce 8,000 to 10,000 units of multifamily new construction inside of 495 in a year. And you can see that in the earlier bars. That will drop to, as you can see, 4,000 or 5,000 or less. And that will stay that way to at least 2030. The latter numbers you see there for production are really brokers trying to guess how many of the projects might get going. And I don't know that we can rely upon those counts. So that's the fundamental problem we're looking at. The other thing we need to understand is our last generation of housing was done at a time of what I'll call free money. So if you look at our Wakefield project, it's 440 units. It's 18% affordable at 80% AMI. Passive house, I will inject here, is a new energy code that came on board July 1. And depending on our contractor estimates, it will add between 5 and 15% to the base construction cost. So our original project in Wakefield, it met the parameters of a low interest rate environment, which is, you see at the top, 5.5%. What's 5.5%? Very simply, you can boil all the money issues of apartment construction down to this. If you build a project for $100 million, that project, when it's open and fully leased, and it pays its operating expenses, it needs to return the rate of return on cost. So at the 2020, that was 5.5% in a 2.5% interest rate environment. Right now, it's 6.5%, and virtually no projects in Greater Boston will be capable of achieving 6.5%. There are too many cost constraints. The new passive house legislation, which is in place, the new passive house code, dilutes returns quite a bit. So you could see that even under the earlier parameters, if we had to build passive house in 2022, it would shrink the return on cost to a level below what was then required for return on cost. Now the return on cost is 6.5%. Our project in Woburn that's ready to go, it's 15% affordable, and it returns 6.11%. So that's really not in the game yet for getting financed. We're trying to see how we can get it there. We aren't subject to passive house there because we pulled the building permit before July 1. If we hadn't, we would be out of the game entirely at 5.9%. These are just the rules of the finance game. No one can do anything about them. You can just look at where the 10-year Treasury bond is. If it's 5 or 6%, no one's going to forego that investment for investment in speculative real estate, however certain the markets are. The other thing that happens is that in transit-oriented development, we've done about 2,600 units over the last few years, most of them on transit, is most localities will not recognize the diminished need for parking. We did a survey with Walker Parking. It found in Eastern Massachusetts, you need 0.75 spaces per unit, less than 1 per unit. Almost all of the localities require at least 1.5. So that's 1/3 more than you need. So if it's 100 spaces and it costs you $25,000 a space, that's $2.5 million that you spend on concrete that you don't need. Zero New Boston is affected by that. It's 1.5%. Haven't been able to get it changed. It's literally next to the platforms, but it diminishes its financing impact. We are going forward in Lexington, where we began working on MBTA communities very shortly after the regulations or guidelines were issued in August of 23. We actually submitted a project in January of 24. At that point, Lexington had its as-of-right zoning in place. It called for 60 feet in height. The town refused to accept our application, despite the as-of-right character, unless we dropped the height 1 full story at least. We did. That cost us 40 units. So that cost us a portion of the return we'd hoped for. The inclusion of 15% in the suburbs for affordability is a big problem. I have sat with Secretary Augustus and others and explained that. At the peak in Boston of the last wave, when we had 2.5% money, we did 12%. In one case, we did 13%. We're not, generally speaking, in Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville at 20%. I don't think there's much prospect of much development, maybe in Alewife, maybe in Cambridge with 20% at 65% AMI. But in a place like Lexington, we went from a project that threatened to be financeable with 240 units and is now well below today's financing hurdles. So we're going to have a hard time getting that financed, even when it's fully approved, which will be by the end of this year. And that's an as-of-right example under MBTA communities. I will say that in other communities that we've talked to, the problems of, well, we'll talk about that. So what does this mean? Well, this is a chart by Walker and Dunlop. The blue are production. And you can see, I said it's about 8,000 average annually. So 2023 looks to be about 7,500. Then you see what happens in 24, 25, 26, and 27. And as I said, 28 is a hope number. Right now, an average rental cost for a 1-bedroom unit in Greater Boston is $2,700 a unit. It historically, over the last 10 years, we've risen at 3.38% in rents. And what you see on those numbers on the brown line of the forecast are the forecasted numbers if rents grow at 3.4%. So in 2028, you're looking at about $3,250 per unit monthly. This takes that same chart and imposes what might happen if the lack of production results in a greater rental increase. Right now, the consensus is 4 to 7%. I would say the consensus is probably fixed around 4.5%. So you can see in 2028, we're looking at rents of something like $3,500 per unit that are today $2,700 per unit. Now, this could be affected by recession. If we have a regional or a national recession or enough people flee the state, it could soften those numbers. It's kind of a hard way to have a solution, but that's it. In the box, you see what a 4.5% rental rate means to consumption of income. It looks like about a $3,400 average rent. We find about $500 in monthly costs for utilities, parking, pet fees, insurance, renter's insurance. So your total monthly occupancy cost is a little south of $4,000 a month. Total occupancy per year, $47,000 a year, which means you better be earning $140,000 to $150,000 to afford a place to live in Greater Boston. We were working very hard for the last few years on MBTA communities. We've given that up, except for Lexington, which, as I just noted, is going to be a challenge. We had contracts for land abutting MBTA parcels in Littleton. We had 2 in Waltham, 1 in West Natick next to the station, and 1 in Plymouth. We've canceled all those contracts. And the reason we canceled is because all of these communities are basically finding ways to work around the actual obligation of zoning near MBTA tracks. In Littleton, we have had a contract for 34 acres next to the station. called MBTA communities required at least 10 acres to be put into MBTA communities. Littleton worked its way on the compliance spreadsheet around that number and placed the zoning on a warehouse, averaged the zoning across a bunch of other things, kind of fudged some of the numbers, and basically got a town meeting to adopt a zoning that will not facilitate or allow housing near the MBTA station in Littleton. And that's the same. The same is in the case in Waltham. Natick, they basically have been planning, and we were working with them on Route 135. They just basically gave it up and put some zoning on downtown Natick where there's not much to build. Plymouth is a story entirely to itself, but we've given that up as well. We had 2 in downtown Waltham, so the 855 cross out, the product production is really closer, is really over 1,000. We had to give it up in downtown and at a site at the Brandeis Roberts station. So we went from about 1,000 MBTA units to what will be 200 units in Lexington. Otherwise, we've dropped all MBTA parcels, and we're not really looking at any more unless the MBTA zoning is in place. Now, the answers we've developed on these issues elude one thing. We continue to search for policy modifications instead of actual production, and it doesn't work. Conversion of office to housing, suburban or downtown, we've tried it, we've looked at it, it just doesn't work. It has to do, when you change use, you change building code. It's an entirely different structural code. You change plumbing, you change HVAC, and you have to change zoning. So that is really not going to produce much. Retail, redeveloping malls is very difficult. Zom looks like it might succeed in Braintree, but you have a lot of factors that are against you, not just neighborhood factors. In those malls, all of those major users have easements cross-governing the property. So you can't just go and build residential unless you can relieve those cross easements with Macy's or whatever the legacy company is, J.C. Penney's. We haven't been able to do it. We tried in Saugus, it just didn't work. I know we're hopeful about ADUs, talking to building inspectors and such. Talked to one building inspector where I thought they would have some. He says he's got none in his office. I think it's challenging to think ADUs are going to really make a difference. The constraints are the first thing is we have deeply challenging financing markets. The second is our state policies are going backwards on housing cost. Unfortunately, you can see our willingness to do affordable housing inclusion was at 18% in Wakefield when we had free money. It was at 12% in St. Gabriel's in Boston. The numbers just aren't going to work at 15 and 20 in today's financial environments. They're just not. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. And I don't have an answer as to what the public policy should be on inclusionary. All I can say is, in most instances, 15% or more will be very, very difficult, if not impossible. What may happen, and we're kind of counting on this in Lexington, is they get rents so high on the market rate rents that maybe you can get it over the goal line. We are dedicated now to higher construction costs. This is a very advanced state in terms of energy, but it has a cost. So construction costs are not going down. They're going up. The move to all electric is costly and difficult. And we have a small problem, which is the utilities don't have that power. It's very hard to get transformers. It's very hard to get power. It's not unusual the day before you open a building for appliance installation and stuff to get a call, as we did in Fenway, saying, I know we've been working on this 4 years. I know you bought the transformers. We don't got them. We don't know when we're going to get them. So we're 6 months behind opening in Fenway, which sounds bad, but what it did is the cycle of Boston is somewhat academically influenced. So if you're not open in August and leasing, you miss that cycle. So we've missed that entire cycle in Fenway, which is a real hit. I think approvals will not at the local level improve, primarily because MBTA didn't go anywhere and we're back to where we were. The other thing that's happening, and there are a lot of subtleties that are not taken into account in the general public dialogue, insurance costs are going through the roof, along with utility costs. We are finding, particularly on wood frame housing, a shrinking availability of insurers and rates that are rising at astronomical amounts, both for the construction period and the operational period. And this is going to have a real impact. I think it's going to get worse. The insurers look across the nation and see hurricanes and droughts and stuff, and they just say, we got to pull back. And when they pull back, they pull everywhere. So that's a problem. It's not enough to stop a project. The other thing people do not realize is that the state itself is a real barrier to housing production. The number of approvals you may need if you have a large enough project to trigger DEP for like sewer tie-in, which is if you have 450 or more units. If you need a wastewater treatment plant on site, they're astronomical in terms of time and money. You have curb cuts and indirect highway access permits. Some of these permits, like indirect highway access permits, are so fuzzy that it's very difficult to deal with them. And it's difficult to avoid them because they're not written down, which is what the case is with MBTA zone of influence. MBTA zone of influence says anywhere within 30 feet of our tracks, we have control of construction. It'll only take you a year or so to get through it. And you're talking about things like drainage ditches, retaining walls. We thought we were done at Zero New Boston and Wakefield. We've only been working on it 3 years, ready to go. And we met with the MBTA again. It's been about a year since we submitted the zone of influence. And they're talking about needing a year to process an application to build a retaining wall. And no one can show me the statute. Goulston can't, Nutter can't. There is no statute. It's just something they do. Chapter 54A is another nuance that's very, very subtle, but very powerful. I can explain all of these. These are not fun. One of the things about this you have to realize is the state approvals don't care about housing as opposed to warehouses. They're the same product. It's the same process. Your application comes in, it goes to the bottom of the pile. And when we get to it, we get to it. Housing's no special class. MEPA, you do more than 450 units, you're into a MEPA statement, which now includes environmental justice. It's a full EIR. It's 18 to 24 months. And it's $1 million in cost. Why we need a MEPA statement on, say, 350 or 400 units beats the hell out of me. I can't figure it out. We're going to try and do it in Assembly Square, but we're being cautioned that we have to prepare MEPA for the first building. How Assembly Square needs a MEPA study of 18 months, I don't know. And I'm not trying to point fingers here. I'm just trying to be blunt. This is just what we're up against. The appeals processes under DEP appeals, that's internal to DEP. You can't get to court for a while. When you do get to court, it's tough. Massachusetts judges are very reluctant to go against appellants. And so whatever the law is, it's not unusual at all to find that you may have the law on your side as written, but that's irrelevant. And there are no state resources really to back up enforcing the MBTA communities law. If you have 177 towns and 75% of them are just basically going to game their way around it, a couple of people in Ed Augustus' office can't do much.
Jay, thank you so much for this incredible setup. You really
Okay.
Yes,
highlighted
this is
some
great.
important issues. I wanted to inform everybody that this is being recorded and will be distributed later, so it will be available if you want to see it. I know some people are interested in the slides as well.
Yes.
If you would like to make those available to the public and to
We will. I just note that the last slide is a compendium of some of the consequences of what this housing gap means.
Yes.
One of the ones that is not well understood, I did want to flag, is the construction industry is gradually shutting down. Most of the contractors are laying off people. Most of the trade unions are on the bench. The problem for that is we already had a small labor force, and this is going to be a bigger long-term problem as we lose this capacity. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
Yes,
that's such an
thank you so
important
much.
point.
Yeah.
Let me turn this over to Scott and our panelists, and they can respond and answer some questions that Scott has for just to help us to understand what we can do about all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay. That was great. And that's some really insightful observations there and some really great stats and numbers that things that I hadn't been aware of, and I follow, and probably a lot of other people, I follow this, try to follow this stuff pretty closely. So welcome to our panelists. We have a great panel here today. And I think we're just going to maybe jump into the questions. And the way we'll do this is I will go by alphabetical order, just briefly introduce yourself, say your name, your title, what you do, and then everybody will get a chance to answer the questions. And one thing is more of a general question now, and Jay has definitely delved into some of the specifics of the challenges here, but one thing that's the bigger picture item here is that, look, we have like 1 million more people in Massachusetts than we did in 1980, and we're building maybe a half, a third of what we built back then when we were building housing in the 80s, and even then we were just kind of in the middle of the pack nationally. So what happened here? I mean, how do we go from a state that was doing okay and, building, an average amount of housing, to one that's, building, just an anemic amount based on the size of the population, the demand of a booming economy? I mean, is this kind of just the rise of NIMBY attitudes, restrictive local zoning rules? And if there are any particularly egregious examples, then feel free to share them. So I'm going to start off with, we'll start off with Jesse. If you want to jump in here and introduce yourself and, what you do.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me. I'm Jesse Kansen-Beninoff. I'm the executive director at Abundant Housing, Massachusetts, and we're a statewide pro-housing advocacy organization. We do grassroots organizing of pro-housing advocates on the local level in communities across the region of the state. And then we also do some policy advocacy on Beacon Hill. Do you want me to go ahead and answer the question, or am I handing it to the next?
No.
speaker?
Yeah, and that's how we'll do it. We'll just, everybody just say who you are and just, what do you think? I mean, what's your kind of take on this issue? What's blocking? What are the big barriers here? Is it just NIMBYism, or is there something deeper? What's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, sure. There's NIMBYism, if you want to call it that, on the local level in communities around the state. We see it in urban areas. I live in Jamaica Plain in Boston. We see opposition to housing production in my own neighborhood, let alone in some of the more suburban or rural communities around the state. I don't know that I'm in a position to necessarily say what the historic development has been, or historic evolution has been. But, I do think a lot of it has to do with a real focus on local control, hyper-local control over land use, planning, zoning, development approvals, et cetera, in Massachusetts. 351 cities and towns, 351 different planning boards, zoning boards, councils. Everyone is making a decision in a vacuum for themselves without really thinking, despite, good work of regional planning agencies, and others. Most of the policy or decision makers on those boards are really just making a decision, based on their own community or what they would like to see in their own community. We know from the research that Catherine Einstein and others at BU did a few years ago, the neighborhood defenders, the vast majority of people who show up in community meetings around housing production in Greater Boston are disproportionately wealthier, whiter homeowners, slightly more male, that are opposed to new housing production. So when that's the people that show up, and those are the people that have the ears of the regulators, the planning board members, the zoning board members, the elected officials, the legislators, that's who decisions are being made for. And that's working to the detriment of the future of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Jesse. Eleanor, do you want to introduce yourself, and what are some of your thoughts on this issue?
Did you call on me? Because you're going to the end.
Yeah,
of the
yes, I'm
alphabet?
calling on you. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Eleanor White. Starting in 1967, I worked for HUD for 15 years, then was co-CEO of what is now Mass Housing. And for the past 30 years, I've been president and CEO of Housing Partners, Inc., which is an affordable housing consulting firm. So I have seen the evolution over these many decades. I think one of the issues historically has been that there was a huge drop-off in federal support for housing. There was a lot of federal money in the 70s and 80s. That dropped off dramatically, and the kind of only program of volume that was left was low-income housing tax credits, which has been a godsend because it's kind of the only one there. Massachusetts has always been a leader in state programs, and more recently in local programs like the Community Preservation Act. It's those public programs that have enabled the construction of what little housing we've been able to produce over the last couple of decades. As you heard from Jay, doing it without public funding is extraordinarily challenging. Doing it with public funding, I will tell you, I would give anything to only have Jay's 5-year timeline, because the last project that my firm closed with a client was 7 years
Wow.
in the making. And that was not for lack of trying, I can assure you. So part of the issue is, as Jay said, just the complexity of getting through the system. And unfortunately, there are pretty good reasons for why each of these permitting processes are there. They're not there just to make trouble for developers. There were good reasons for them to be there originally. I think clearly they need some revisiting, some re-looking at to make the whole thing simpler. And I'll close with saying that in the heyday of production in the 70s and 80s, the reason there was a heyday was that there was basically a federal program for public housing and a federal program for affordable housing, the various Section 8 programs, that meant you could go start to finish with one program and got it done. And it was relatively a lot easier.
Well, that's interesting, right? Instead of having with often projects, right, or they're just cobbling together all these different sources and tax credits, and it's I can imagine labor intensive and just draws the whole thing out, and it shrinks the amount you can actually do. Kendon, would you like to jump in here and introduce yourself and give your thoughts on what's driving this? Why aren't we getting as much housing built? And I know you're dealing with a lot of sales, and also you look at the development side, so you kind of have your pulse on that side of the market.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, my name is Kendon Carr. I'm the Vice President of Multifamily Investment Sales at Colliers in the Boston office. We're the 5th largest global real estate services firm in the world. And fundamentally, I just think it just comes down to people are afraid of change. They've lived in these communities their whole lives, and they don't want 400 units in these giant developments coming to ruin their quaint downtowns, basically. And then the other fundamental reason I think they don't want to allow these developments in their communities is just they're just protecting their assets and their wealth. And generally, the more supply there is, the less valuable your house is. So those are basically the two fundamental reasons I see for the rampant NIMBYism in these communities. And I go to these meetings all the time, and there's always some lady who's lived in the community since 1965 and will just wax poetic about how the community was so much better back then, and we don't want any new development. So what needs to be done, I'm not sure. I know that people are looking for 200,000 units by 2030. I think that's virtually impossible with the current state of affairs. Maybe by 2040 if things open up. But I don't think 200,000 by 2030 is really realistic at all. That's 40,000 units a year, and for the next 5 years. And the entire inventory of Boston that has been approved but not being developed, not in the ground, is only 23,000. And Boston is the economic driver. So even with all these tools, with the ADUs, the MBTA Communities Act, I don't think we're going to be able to get there anytime soon, unfortunately.
Thanks, Kenton. Yeah, no, I mean, having covered many of these meetings over many years, it's a familiar theme where, people get up and yeah, it seems, you would think they're going to like, level the whole town center and, just build a skyscraper and it's like a, 200 unit apartment project. You're like, what planet are you on? But I mean, it's different. People don't like change, and for some people, it's clearly very threatening. Um, so we're going to move on to David. David, you want to introduce yourself and jump in?
Hi, everyone. David Stewart. I'm the founder at Flat Rock Real Estate developer. Been doing development in the Boston area for only the last 20 years, not like a lot of you. But it's interesting over the course of my career because I've seen it. It's for a while it got much harder and took a lot more time to get a project approved. And obviously we're going to talk about the cost implications of that. And Jay highlighted some of that. But it seems to me that now maybe in the last few years, now that we're talking MBTA communities, and I have experienced myself where you come out in support of the development at planning board hearings, you're getting some counterbalancing on the IMBY side, which I think is helping. Now, is it enough? We're certainly not going back to the 1980s and how much easier it was to do development, but I do think that we're going in the right direction to be able to deliver projects faster. But it's as folks have pointed out, and you can see the stats, faster from a Massachusetts standpoint, it's still going to take you 4 to 5 years to deliver a unit if you start today. So we do have a problem that's not going away.
Thank you, David. And Clark, you want
Thanks for organizing this, Scott.
to?
I'm Clark,
Thank you for
Clark
coming.
Ziegler. I'm
Taking
executive
part.
director of the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. For those of you who don't know us, we finance affordable rental housing, first-time home ownership for lower-income home buyers. We work with, at this point, almost every community in the Commonwealth to encourage them to support and promote additional housing development, and we have a small data and policy team. Couple quick points. One is I just want to double down on Jesse's comments about local government and our form of government here. It's unusual. It's not typical around the country. We have the average or the median jurisdiction in Massachusetts serves 11,000 residents. So literally you have all these units of government making up their own individual rules, not just around zoning, but also about septic regulation, about wetlands regulation, on and on and on. And I think a system that was designed that way is almost guaranteed to deliver this result, right? Which is people being so locally focused that everybody loses sight over our statewide and regional interests. And so we can go one of two ways. We can, do what other states do and remove some of this land use regulation to the regional or county level. Well, we don't have counties left, the regional level, or pull some of that authority back, or we can do things that establish guardrails like MBTA communities was designed to do, like the new ADU law is designed to do. But it's sort of a political choice. Is there a holy war against home rule, or are we going to find some ways to set a floor on how communities must behave around housing? And I think we're in the midst of that debate. My goal is to be at least a little bit more optimistic than Jay today. And I think the jury's out on MBTA communities, quite honestly. We've worked in about 130 of the 177, providing consultants and working with local folks. And I think, to David's point, I think there's been a little bit of a political shift in a number of communities in the right direction. So I think we have to really make it work, but I think we have ways to go there. And last point I would make is I think the state owns a lot of this problem. I think Jay really made this point as well, where the left hand and the right hand aren't working together. We have no consistent state policy around water and sewer infrastructure, and where development is desired, supported by infrastructure or will be. I think it's, that is like screaming for attention at this point. A lot of the talk about extending MWRA services, I think, is also very relevant to where we grow as a region and as a state. I think we have a lot of work cut out for us, but I do feel like there are a number. I think there are more eyes on this problem than there have been, in my, 40 years in this field. And I feel like we're making finally making some serious movement, but still not enough.
Could I
Yeah,
inject,
thank you.
could I inject
Yeah.
one thing?
Yes,
Which is, I think that where we are is a collection of where Greater Boston is okay with being. This is the results we have are consistent with what you would expect for this system. It's a system that is designed to not
Yep.
produce housing. One thing that we have not done, and I'm disappointed in, is the state needs and the region needs to say, we've got to build housing and we're going to do it. We're going to do it, and the way we're going to do it is as follows. I think, for example, it's a big mistake for infrastructure funds to be used as a stick to beat you if you don't play ball with MBTA communities. Instead, those funds should be devoted to communities that are set to play ball, with projects that are set to play ball. There's no place in state government I can call up and say, guys, we're on the cusp of doing X, but these, this, and this are problems. Can you help us? That doesn't exist. There is, we have good organizations and staffing to deal with net zero and climate change and transportation projects. There is no such animal in government. There's no such animal in this region. There's no one that is pulling together these policies. It's very simple to make housing go to the top of the pile of state agency approvals, but we don't do it. Nor do we have the staff. We have no staff and resources committed to this. There's no one you can say, well, there's 15 people over there that are trying to get these projects off the ground. We pay communities under 40R if they produce units. Instead, what we've done under MBTA communities is we punish you by withholding infrastructure. But, Woburn's done 3,000 units, and they turn and they look at people and say, why should I do more when Winchester's done none? Well, maybe the 40R piece should apply, and there should be direct financial benefits. There are a number of policies that would work, but someone has to decide, this is important, we've got to get it done, and here is the team and the organization to do it. We don't have that.
thanks, Jay. That brings us into a question I had on the MBTA Communities Act. Because I think now that we're getting into it, and now that we're in the middle of the approvals, the picture has certainly shifted. When it was first, I remember writing about it when the Baker administration was working with the legislature to get it passed, and it was touted as, maybe producing 200,000 new housing units, and that was said with a straight face. Now the latest estimates I've seen are like 20 to 40,000. So my question is, has this been overbuilt? And if it has, and I think maybe we're getting at it, what are some of the things that need to be done to, well, I guess the two things. What are the things that need to be done to make it more workable, like to get more communities on board so that actually you could do more than like 20,000 units? And two, are there things beyond MBTA Communities Act that the state needs, zoning reforms, the state needs to be looking at? Okay, we've done this, we're in the middle of this, but are we just going to sit here for the next 10 years until we figure this one out and then move on to the next incremental piece? That would not seem like a way to really get housing production up. So I'm going to turn back to you, Jesse, if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I would say from the beginning, I don't know that I actually ever thought that the projection of units produced under MBTA communities would be 200,000. I think that's approximately what the zoned capacity is, that if you take the aggregate of all 177 communities, they need to zone for. But as the Baker administration, the Healy administration, HLC and others have said, this is a zoning mandate, not a production mandate. 20,000 homes produced under this law certainly isn't solving our crisis. It's not addressing our full shortage, but it's potentially 20,000 more homes built than we would have without this law. I think the point, and one of the points that Jay made in the intro is that we're substituting policy for production, but we need policy to get to that production. So MBTA communities is one really important step in that. We need an entire toolkit. ADU legalization alone will not do it, as Jay rightfully said in the intro, but it's another piece of the puzzle. We need to continue this, and we can't just do one little zoning reform every legislative session for the next 6 or 8 years, whatever, 3 or 4 legislative sessions. We need to do more at once. There are some big things we really need to address. We have incredibly large minimum lot sizes in Massachusetts, 2 or 3 acre minimum lot sizes in some communities. That adds huge costs, particularly when the only thing you are allowed to build on those lots is a single family home. That exacerbates the cost, both to build and ultimately to purchase or rent that home. We need to reduce minimum lot sizes here. Parking reform, that also Jay mentioned in the beginning. Other states around the country and cities around the country have made progress towards eliminating the costly parking mandates that, just as Jay said, add cost and pavement to projects that aren't even utilized. That money could better be going to building homes for people rather than storage for cars. These are the types of things that I'm really excited to begin talking about with the legislature come January in the next legislative session. Clark and I have, for the last 10 months or something, since the beginning of this year, been serving on this Unlocking Housing Production Commission that Governor Healy convened and appointed us and a dozen or so other folks to. I think there's some really, really interesting things that are coming out of this commission in a report that I think should be published very early next year, looking not at just zoning reform, but regulatory reform, statewide planning, incentives for production, things like that. So really looking forward to that and hoping that gives the Healy administration and the legislature the momentum that they need to continue doing big things to produce more housing. The only other thing I'll say briefly is that I think another benefit of the MBTA Communities Act is that you do have, as David and Clark and others said, you do have more people, residents of communities who are coming to town meeting, to planning board hearings, et cetera, and saying, we recognize there is a crisis in our community, in our state. I cannot afford to downsize in my community. My child who went out of state to college can't afford to move back here, even with a professional salary job. So people are showing up. We, as Abundant Housing, have worked in 24 communities doing deep grassroots organizing in support of zoning reform and housing production for the last few years. And there's this whole group of the YIMBYs, or the pro-housing folks, around the state, who are coming out in ways that I don't think they did for decades before that. And it's not just us. It's CHAPA and their municipal engagement initiative. MHP has been helpful. There's a bunch of groups involved in this, but we're actually seeing regular residents come out and say yes in my backyard to pro-housing zoning reform and production. So I think that's a tangible benefit that will lead to more housing.
Thank you, Jesse. Kendon, when you're dealing with companies or they're buying or selling or looking to develop, I mean, are they following these changes? Are they looking at it and saying, maybe there are more opportunities here, or are they, or maybe it's the opposite, where if you can actually get a project built, then you're kind of somewhat secure from any competition. So how do they recognize any, how are they viewing the market here in terms of whether they want to be in part of it in terms and what the benefits might be or not?
Well, I've worked on a few of these at the opinion of value level, and then we actually have one in the market right now in Wellesley that are in a MBTA community zone, and there's very strong interest in getting these projects developed. Everyone and anyone who is a developer wants to be in these communities, especially inside 128. I guess one of the biggest challenges is, like Jay was speaking earlier at the beginning of the call, are the feasibility of these projects. So basically, outside of 128, these projects really aren't that feasible. You need at least a $4 square foot rent to even back of the envelope like if it's below that, it is not even worth like looking at the community. So if you're in Newton, you could probably get $4, $5, $5.50 per square foot. But if you're out in Shrewsbury, it might not make those rents. So inside 128, every developer is looking in Brookline, Lexington, Wellesley, Newton. If you can get in those communities, there's very strong interest. The problem is you can't compel anybody to sell their property. Like if they don't want to sell, they just don't have to sell. So like Jesse said, it's a zoning reform. It's not like you can't force people to sell just because they're in that zone. So how to develop, or how do you motivate these people to sell or partner with the developer to get these units? That's more on the policy side, which I'm not an expert on, but that is the biggest challenge. The two biggest challenges I see is, even with the strong demand, is the communities that have enough rent per square foot, and then compelling the people in those MBTA community zones to actually want to sell.
Yeah, it's a challenge. That's for sure. I mean, there's not to have in those areas to actually find available sites that people are willing to part with. Or David, what are your thoughts on that? Are you dealing with any of the MBTA communities?
Yeah, so
sites,
I've looked
or-
at a ton of these sites, and what others have said is absolutely true. And the one bottleneck that hasn't been mentioned is, once you parse through all the sites and find, quote, a good site, and you convince the owner that they might want to partner with you or sell, then there seems to be definitely an infrastructure bottleneck. So a lot of these sites don't have sanitary sewers anywhere near them. Water mains, that's easy to run a water main, and a lot of communities have it. But to me, I've noticed sanitary infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure is a really big bottleneck. And that's one that the state could help out with in terms of getting money, getting a project going. You saw Jay's chart, how long it takes to open a project, to get a project going. Well, there's a ton of time right now that the state, and maybe it's the MWRA, you could be out designing sanitary systems, getting the shovels in the ground and getting it built, so that you're connecting these sites where the overlay districts exist. So it's both money and time and effort. That would be a huge win on the production side for housing.
Eleanor, I know you work with a lot of communities, right? How are they viewing this? And are we being fair to them, or are they, some of them, more maybe willing, and they just have concerns, right? Maybe more willing to do housing than they're being given credit for.
Well, obviously some are more willing than others. I was very happy to hear Kendon mention Newton, where I live, because in Newton, there's actually been quite a lot of construction recently, much more than for a long time. And most of it has an affordable component, which is also great. The other sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, are the gateway communities, which really welcome new production. You don't have to twist their arms. You don't have to fight screaming mobs at the zoning board. And the issue there tends to be feasibility. Many of the best opportunities have been mill buildings. Now, the problem with mill buildings is you've got to have a developer with pretty deep pockets, because they take forever to get done, because you've got to go through historic reviews. The costs are very high, but the state has been very supportive, as have CPA boards, in providing subsidy funding to make them feasible. I will mention, and I'm not going to go into any detail because it's kind of a long story, but there is something called the Workforce Housing Trust Fund program, which has been on the books, passed in 2016, but never implemented. And it is limited, unfortunately, in my view, to the gateway cities. And it provides a source financing for market workforce housing, which can include up to 20% affordable units. And there have been some discussions about that in fact being implemented. And I think that would be, it wouldn't be a huge volume of production, but it could be easily started because it's on the books.
Thank you, Eleanor. Clark, you had mentioned the MBTA Communities Act earlier. Are we being too negative about it, or is it, or maybe just being more realistic about its real potential and where it fits in with all the overall efforts that need to be made?
I think we, as I said earlier, I think it's a work in progress. I think it's moving us forward in some ways. It's not the be all end all housing solution for the Commonwealth. One clarification: it was actually not Governor Baker's proposal. He decided to sign the bill, but it was a legislative initiative that he ultimately signed on to. One thing I'd want to additional thing beside MBTA communities that I really want to flag or address again is around local environmental regulation. It is such an impediment around infrastructure, especially on wastewater treatment. We have the vast majority of communities in Metro Boston have local septic regulations that exceed Title V and wetlands bylaws that exceed the State Wetlands Protection Act. We did a case study in Sudbury. It happens to be a project that Jesse was the project manager for. A B'nai B'rith senior housing project, about 120 units or so. And it was exempt from local regulations because of environmental regulations because of 40B. So it's sort of a good way to measure the impact. Had the local regulations applied, had it been market rate housing, it would have cut the number of units by more than half. And that's not atypical with other local regulations around, around Eastern Massachusetts. So I think environmental science belongs at the state level. That's where the expertise is. That's where it can most effectively, where it can be managed most effectively. And until we really come to grips with that, I think it's just yet another way that local communities find devices to slow or impede development. And the net result is more sprawl, single-family homes on much larger lots. It's not good for climate. It's not good for affordability. It's not good for transportation and mobility. But all these the combination of zoning and environmental regulation locally is driving us away from the kind of densities we need to solve our problem.
Thanks, Clark.
Scott, can I jump in for
Just
1
second.
minute? I just want to refer back to something that Jay said about there not being anybody to integrate all of this vast array of approvals.
Sure.
There was a precedent under Governor Dukakis where he had somebody in his administration who would bring together all of the relevant agencies, get them around a table with the local people, and they would come up to what they called euphemistically an arrangement, which meant everybody agreed to buy in to a specific project, and these projects got done kind of in record time. It was a small experiment, short-lived, but it really worked. And it would get to the problem that Jay flagged, which is absolutely correct, that you just got to deal with 15 different people to get a project done.
I was a servant to that group, which is called the Office of State Planning, and my job was to take their policies and go into the communities and come back and serve it up to Fred Salvucci and Evelyn Murphy and Frank Keith. It was very effective. I've recommended it to state office holders here. I don't know why that isn't a model that could be done for housing. That staff was about 20 people doing those projects. That's what you need. Coming back quickly to something Clark said and what Eleanor said about gateway communities, we're building on the Superfund in Woburn, and we're building multifamily. Well, that's EPA. One thing I've discovered as we try to replicate that success is that we're an industrial community, and as corporations have left behind their contamination, they actually don't clean it up. They clean it up to a level to permit industrial development, and then they slap a deed restriction on it, preventing residential development. If I were free of that right now, I have sites that probably total 2,000 units. But I have to go back to the Dow Chemicals. There's a site in Medford that's an Medford's been great. There's a site in Medford owned by GE that's probably a 400 unit site. GE won't talk about it. They don't want any potential liability, and no one challenges them. The funny thing is that tool is to moderate their cleanup cost. So as Eleanor's saying, if we could concentrate policies not only to do things like Clark is saying, which is bulldoze through some of the permitting, but to work on policies and work with companies to say, we need you to do this. We have hospitals that are closing left and right, and they can't find staffing and they can't find housing. But here are campuses you can't develop on, like Beverly Hospital in the North Shore. But no one pulls this together and says to the CEOs, you need to contribute to the solution of these problems, not necessarily financially, but in terms of your policies. And that lack of a command control point is really a big deficiency.
That's really
Sorry.
interesting. I want to get Jeff in here. I'm sorry, Jeff. I don't know what happened. I'm just getting you into the discussion here. And I know you bring a pretty interesting perspective on which doesn't get discussed, I think, often enough from the single family home side, building single family homes and it's an odd kind of situation, right? Because most people want to live in a single family house, right? And those numbers aren't doing very well either, I guess, in terms of what are you seeing out there? Is it just the same as it's, kind of low levels, or is it picking up, or any changes you're seeing in terms of the market and demand and the ability maybe to produce more moderately priced homes? Jeff, you're on mute. You got to unmute yourself.
There we go.
Oh, here we
Sorry.
go. Yep. No worries.
So in my business right now, he who has permits is king. I mean, it's that simple. There is such a low supply of new construction housing that we just started a 13 lot project in Stoneham, and I've got 40 buyers for it. That's how bad it is out there. But I want to back up a little bit because there's two important points that I want to bring out. You talked about housing being built at the rate of somewhere in the 40,000 permit range in the 80s, and we're now down below 20,000 permits. I will tell you three things that didn't exist in the 80s: inclusionary housing, local wetland bylaws, and local Title V. Those all came about over the last 10 to 15 years. And those
Jeff, what was the last one?
local Title V.
Okay.
So in other words, we can build septic systems by state regs for 110 gallons per bedroom. Some communities are 150 to 200 gallons per bedroom. We just built a 51 lot project in Clark's hometown. They don't allow us to perk between September and April, which, it's like the soil conditions are going to change. High water table is high water table. It's just blatant regulatory creep. And it's all, in my industry, it's been because of kids. They don't want the kids overpowering the schools. Now, most communities have a depopulation going on in their school systems, which is hilarious. Look what you did. But I think Clark probably said it best. It's the political will. The enemy of zoning reform in this state is home rule. That is the enemy. As long as home rule is in effect, you will see the Miltons of the state just do what they do. And it's a battle. I'm with Jay. Our typical project, from the day we sign a purchase agreement to the day one of our first homeowners moves in, 4 to 5 years.
It's such a long lag time, right? And given the demand and time is money, right? Tying up a site.
I mean, we build in New Hampshire. When we were in New Hampshire, we can sign a purchase and sale agreement have it permitted inside of 9 months, have new residents inside of 12, 24 months. In New Hampshire, they don't have a land court system. They have a housing appeals. They turn
Hmm.
things around in 90 days. You go to the
So it's really-
Massachusetts land court, 3 to 5 years. I know, I'm there now.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of people have moved, right? We've lost population and they've, you have the suburbs of southern New Hampshire. I want to, I think I want to be really respectful of everybody's time here, and we're past 1 o'clock, so we're going to wrap things up. There are a lot of good questions here. I may do a chat later on. We could deal with some of those. People want to go on later, I'll send a link out for that. But definitely wanted to thank all the panelists, Jay, for your presentation, all the panelists for your time here. It's really, and I'm going to be writing about it, and we'll be posting this video as well. So I hope to bring more attention to this issue. Really amazing things, points here that I don't think I've seen explained in that kind of level of detail and so clearly. In the press, or, even in some public discussions. So we're gonna wrap it up here. We will, I will thank you all for coming. Jen,
As
did you want to
we-
jump in here for a second?
Yes, as we wrap up, I just want to ask people to mark their calendars for January 16th, Thursday. We are going to have another forum and be taking up the issue of what's happening in downtown Boston and the development there.
Yep, that's a big deal right now, obviously, and with the rise of remote work, and now potentially increased commercial taxes. And so thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you then. And if you haven't already subscribed to Contrarian Boston, please consider doing that.
What's the best way for us to make our slides available?
All right, so send them to me and I'll figure something out. Because
Okay.
we have some great slides, but I had to figure out how I want to, I can run some of them in a story, or I can run them separately, maybe, where people can.
Okay. Also,
Access.
people feel free to email or contact me, and we'll get it to you from CCNF. It's jdoherty@ccfne.com.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all so much, and appreciate taking the time. And this was a great discussion, and hopefully we'll see. We'll be back again in mid-January with another issue here. Thank you.
You.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you all.
Bye.